Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the grimy, dangerous and definitely not Instagram-worthy world of factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. Now I know, when someone says Industrial Revolution, you probably picture a steam train puffing dramatically through a foggy English village, a heroic inventor covered in soot, and a top-hatted gentleman clapping as progress unfolds. But tonight, we're skipping the fancy museums and textbook nostalgia. Because this is the story of the people who didn't make history. They endured it. We're talking about the actual workers, the ones who rose before the sun, crammed into fire-trap factories, fed machines that didn't care whether they had bones, and got paid just enough to not starve. Sometimes. Now, before we crank up the noise and shovel coal into this narrative engine, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy these deep dives into the raw, weird, and often uncomfortable truths of the past. And hey, leave a comment down below telling me what time it is and where you're watching from. I love seeing how many time zones we're smuggling history into. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and get ready to travel back to the 1800s, where your dreams didn't die, they just got crushed under a steam press. Let's be clear, no one ever said, when I grow up, I want to feed cotton into a spinning machine for 16 hours a day while losing bits of my soul and possibly a finger. Being a factory worker wasn't a career, it was a sentence. Part 1. Welcome to hell, now punch in. Picture this. It's 1834. You're 12 years old. You wake up in a slum. Your ceiling leaks. Your breakfast is stale bread and maybe some boiled oats if you're lucky. You sprint to the textile mill to avoid being docked wages for being late. There's no clock-in system. There's a bell, and if you miss it... The overseer locks the gates and you lose a day's pay, which could mean no dinner. Factories opened at 5 or 6 a.m. and didn't stop until 7 or 8 p.m. That's 12 to 16 hours of standing, stooping, hauling, cutting, spinning, hammering, non-stop. You were allowed 2 short breaks, one for breakfast, one for lunch. Blink and you missed them. And no, there were no bathroom breaks. Many workers just held it. Others peed in corners. Some factory floors even had discipline buckets. Let that sink in. Let's say you worked in a cotton mill. Your job might be to feed threads into the spinning frame. Thousands of moving parts flying by your face at insane speeds. And if your sleeve got caught, you were done. There were no safety guards, no emergency shut-off buttons, and if your hand went into the rollers, it came out in fewer pieces than it started. Amputations were so common that some factories had special benches just for maimed workers. Oh, and if a kid got caught in the machine, the rest of the line just kept working. Stopping production was more expensive than saving a child's life. Your job wasn't to be good, it was to survive. Let's get into it. Kids were the backbone of industrial labour. Why? They were cheap, small, and couldn't unionize. Perfect labour force. Children as young as 6 were hired as scavengers, crawling under running machines to pick up fallen cotton or adjust parts. The machines didn't stop for them. In some British mills, kids made up over half the workforce. Most of them started working full-time before they ever learned to read. Some slept in the factory dormitories, worked 72 hours a week, and sent their pay straight to their parents, or landlords. By age 10, many had permanent spinal damage, missing fingers, or chronic respiratory illness from inhaling dust, soot and fibres every day. Legislation eventually tried to step in. The Factory Act of 1833 banned kids under 9 and limited older ones to 48 hours a week. But you know what most factories did? They faked the paperwork and lied about ages. The machines kept spinning, and the kids kept crawling. If the machines didn't get you, the air would. Factories were hellholes of toxic particles. Cotton mills were full of lint, dust and damp. You'd inhale it all shift long, leading to bisonosis, also called brown lung. If you were in a coal plant or foundry, you had black lung, lead poisoning, or manganese madness. Yes, that's a real thing. And there were no windows. Factory owners sealed them shut so the cotton fibres stayed moist. Fresh air, not on the profit margin. Workers often came home with chronic coughs, infections and early signs of tuberculosis, if they didn't die from an infection first. And if you were wondering whether they wore masks or gloves, they didn't, because those cost money. Let's talk about wages. Men made barely enough to keep a family fed. Women made half that. Children made about 10% of an adult's wages for the same hours. You'd work all week and still have to choose between bread, coal or soap. If you were injured, there was no compensation. You just got fired. Housing? You rented a room. Not a house, a room, often with 2 other families. 12 people, 1 shared outhouse, 0 privacy. Sickness spread like wildfire. Typhoid, cholera, dysentery. Entire tenements would be wiped out in a month. And somehow, through all that, you still had to get up for work, because hunger waits for no one. Let's say you had the guts to complain. Maybe you asked for shorter shifts or safer conditions. What happened? You got blacklisted. Factories kept secret logs of agitators, people who tried to unionize or organize strikes, and made sure no one else hired them. In the US, the Pinkertons would show up to literally beat strikers into submission. In Britain, strikers were imprisoned or sent to the colonies. Even whispering about workers' rights was enough to lose your job, your home, and your future, because the alternative was starving to death. Millions of people were pushed off farms, forced into cities, and left with one option: work in a factory or die in the streets. Some dreamed of better. A few managed to escape, to start small shops, join worker co-ops, or emigrate. But most, they just kept working, kept coughing, kept surviving. They fell in love on factory floors, snuck kisses in stairwells, shared crusts of bread. They laughed when they could. They endured because they had to. And slowly, painfully, they built the pressure that would spark labour unions, safety laws and modern workplace protections. So the next time someone tells you the Industrial Revolution was just innovation and progress, remind them it was also blood, smoke and child labour. Factories were temples to profit, and the workers, the sacrifice. If you made it to the end, you just pulled a 16-hour shift without losing a finger. Congrats. Like the video. Subscribe if you want more brutally honest history, and let me know in the comments what would have broken you first. The hours, the noise, or the smell. Next episode, we're diving into the first sub-story, the disturbing world of child labour in the cotton mills. You might want to bring tissues. Until then, get some rest. You're not on shift anymore. And if you thought adult factory work was brutal, wait until you hear what they did to the kids. Because while grown men lost fingers to looms and inhaled coal dust until their lungs gave out, children, literal children, were crawling under those same machines while they were still running, and nobody blinked. Child labour during the Industrial Revolution wasn't rare, it was the system. Working class families couldn't survive on a single wage. So the solution was simple. Everyone worked. Mum, Dad, and every child, old enough to stand upright and reach the machinery, which, according to factory owners, meant about 5 years old. 6 if you were lucky. In cotton mills, kids were hired as scavengers, a title that sounds cute until you learn what it meant. They crawled beneath enormous spinning machines, picking up dropped threads and clearing out fluff. The machines didn't stop for them. If their little arms slipped, or if they stood too soon, the metal didn't forgive. Some children were paid to oil moving parts mid-operation. Imagine being 8 years old, climbing into a maze of turning gears, soaked in sweat, in a building that was 100 degrees in the summer, and hoping you didn't sneeze at the wrong moment. Accidents weren't just common, they were expected. Losing a finger was a rite of passage. Losing an arm meant your family got a few shillings and a new kid was hired before the blood even dried. Factory overseers didn't see children as people. They were tools, disposable ones. And while the textile mills were deadly, coal mines were something else entirely. Boys and girls as young as 7 worked as trappers, sitting alone in dark tunnels for 12 hours a day, opening and closing heavy wooden doors to control airflow. No lights, no talking, just pitch-black silence and the hope that the next rumble wasn't a cave-in. Older kids hauled coal in wagons, crawling on hands and knees through passages too narrow for grown men. They wore leather belts chained to carts and dragged hundreds of pounds behind them. Their backs twisted, their knees gave out, their growth stunted. Some were dead by 20, many never even made it that far. One 8-year-old girl testified in a government inquiry that she worked underground 6 days a week, never saw sunlight, and often passed out from heat and exhaustion. When asked what she did when she was sick, she said, "I go to work." She didn't say it angrily. She wasn't being dramatic. That's just what you did. You went to work. And here's the thing. This wasn't a secret. People knew. Factory owners, politicians, religious leaders. They all saw it. And for decades, they just didn't care. Some argued it built character. That work was good for children. That idleness led to sin. And besides, the factories needed nimble fingers and small bodies. What were they supposed to do? Hire adults? Eventually the horror started to leak. Reformers began publishing reports. Journalists snuck into factories. Artists sketched starving kids with soot-covered faces and hollow eyes. The public started to squirm. That pressure led to the 1833 Factory Act in Britain, the first real attempt to protect child workers. It made it illegal for kids under 9 to work full-time, and limited hours for those aged 9 to 13. It even required a few hours of schooling per week. Sounds good, right? In practice, it was a joke. Factory owners lied about ages, forged documents, bribed inspectors, and threatened parents. The machines never stopped. The children never stopped. In the United States, laws came even slower. In some US factories, up to 40% of the workforce was under 16. It wasn't until the 20th century that nationwide laws began to meaningfully limit child labour, and even then, enforcement was weak. Kids didn't just work in textiles and mines, they were in glass factories exposed to 1600-degree furnaces. They were in matchstick factories, breathing in white phosphorus that rotted their jaws. Literally rotted them. It was called phossy jaw. Their faces collapsed from the inside out, and employers said they lacked discipline. Children also worked in chemical plants, tobacco shops, brick kilns. Any place an adult might die, a child was probably there too, because they were cheaper, because they didn't complain, because they didn't matter, until slowly they did. Some of those kids survived long enough to fight back. They started whispering about strikes, they passed messages, they faked injuries to give younger kids breaks, and by the late 1800s, children, especially teenage girls, were joining labour movements. In 1834, over 800 mill girls in Lowell, Massachusetts, walked out in protest of wage cuts. Most were under 18. In 1903, labour organiser Mother Jones led a march of child workers from Philadelphia to New York, holding signs that said, "We want to go to school, not to work." These weren't rare moments, they were early sparks in the growing fire of labour reform. But even with change, the damage had already been done. Generations lost their health, their safety, and their childhoods in the name of progress. They built the bones of modern industry at the cost of their own. And the factories, they kept spinning. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and its glorious inventions, the steam engine, the spinning jenny, the telegraph, remember that behind every breakthrough was a child who never had a birthday party, never learned to read, never saw daylight for weeks. History remembers the inventors. But the children were there too, sweating, bleeding, and growing old before they turned 13. And they weren't just background noise, they were the gears. Up next, let's shift the spotlight to a group just as exploited, just as vital, and just as overlooked. The factory girls. Teenagers in corsets and clogs who weren't just working to survive, but trying to carve out a shred of dignity in a world built to break them. While children were crawling under machines and choking on cotton dust, their older sisters weren't exactly sipping tea upstairs. They were standing at the looms, working the spinning frames or hauling buckets of boiling dye. Teenagers, sometimes barely more than kids themselves, thrown into adulthood with nothing but an apron, a number tag, and a shift that never seemed to end. These were the factory girls of the Industrial Revolution, the daughters of farm labourers, seamstresses, widows. Some as young as 12, others just barely into their 20s. They came from poverty, from crowded homes, from villages with no future, and they went to work in the mills. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Some were supporting siblings, some were orphans, some were told by their parents, "This is how we all eat." And so they walked, sometimes for miles, to loom rooms packed shoulder to shoulder with noise, heat, and the constant vibration of machines pounding through the floor. If you've ever heard the term mill girl, it wasn't just a nickname. It was a job description, a life, and a social category all rolled into one, especially in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, which became a poster child for the ideal female industrial worker. Employers painted a picture of young, clean, church-going girls who worked with dignity, sang hymns at lunch, and went to sleep reading poetry. Reality? Slightly different. These girls worked 13-hour days, 6 days a week. They lived in overcrowded boarding houses with strict rules, curfews, and fines for breaking them. The rooms were often infested, the food was bland, and the rent was taken directly from their pay. You worked. You slept. You repeated. Inside the factory, the noise was overwhelming. The air choked with fibres and fumes. Talking was discouraged. Sitting was prohibited. Going to the toilet? A luxury. Passing out from heat or exhaustion? Pretty common. Most of the women worked the spinning frames, feeding endless lines of thread through bobbins at speeds just fast enough to take a fingertip if you weren't careful. Others hauled sacks of raw cotton, measured bolts of cloth, or managed vats of steaming dye that could cause chemical burns if it splashed. And it always splashed. And of course, they were paid less than men, sometimes half as much. Because the logic of the day said women didn't need full wages. They were just helping the family, or earning a little pocket money before they married. Tell that to the girls buying their own food, clothing and medicine while sending money home. And don't think the danger was just from machines or chemicals. Harassment was common. Overseers were men. Girls were young. There were no rules, no complaints department, no safe space. You smiled. You stayed quiet. You endured. But here's where the story shifts, because the factory girls, unlike the children we left behind in the last story, were old enough to fight back. In 1834, when mill owners in Lowell tried to cut wages, over 800 girls walked out. Teenage girls, in ankle-length skirts and wooden shoes, organising one of America's earliest strikes. They formed committees. They wrote protest letters. They gave speeches. One wrote, "We're not slaves. We will not be sacrificed for profit." And for a brief moment, the newspapers couldn't look away. 2 years later, in 1836, they struck again, this time more organised, more united. They marched through the streets. They forced management to take notice. Sure, the strikes didn't always win. Wages were rarely restored. Some girls were fired or blacklisted, but they made one thing clear. They weren't just gears in the machine. They were watching, and the movement spread. In England, women textile workers in Manchester and Leeds began whispering about strikes. Girls from lace factories, button workshops, and sewing rooms started to follow suit. In the decades that followed, women formed unions, joined protest marches, and demanded, at the very least, a life that didn't break them by 25. But fighting back didn't mean the work stopped. Most girls still clocked in the next day, still inhaled the same dusty air, still dodged the same spinning belts that could rip a braid clean off your head. In fact, many girls cut their hair short, Not for fashion, but survival. Long hair meant long strands in machinery, and more than one girl left work bleeding from the scalp, clutching what used to be her hair and part of her skin. If you were injured, you were sent home, no compensation, no medical care, no follow-up. If you were too slow, fined. If you missed a shift, replaced. Romance, of course, still happened, behind stairwells, on lunch breaks, in notes passed between machines. A girl might fall for a boy working the boiler room. A whisper here, a stolen kiss there, a promise of better things they both knew were probably lies. But what else did they have? Sometimes girls got pregnant, if they were unmarried. Fired, if they were married. Frowned upon, because a pregnant body couldn't keep up with the machines. No maternity leave, no cradles in the corner. Just, you can't work anymore. Still, they came back when they could. Some lied about their age, some brought babies in secret. One girl was caught breastfeeding in a supply closet. They fired her the next day. And yet, despite everything, there was something else. Pride. Not in the job, but in the survival. These girls were poor, but they bought their own boots, saved for books, attended night lectures, shared newspapers. Some became writers, thinkers, even labour leaders. They weren't just workers. They were women standing on the edge of a world that told them to stay quiet and choosing to speak anyway. Their letters survive, their testimonies, their names, scratched into boarding house walls and factory floors. You might not find them in textbooks, but they're there. They fought for themselves and for the girls who came next. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution and we hear about the Lowell system or the rise of the female labourer, remember, that's not a system. That's a girl in a corset standing next to a machine that could kill her, working for pennies, singing hymns to keep from crying, and still finding the strength to demand something better. She wasn't just part of the revolution, she was the revolution. Next, we're stepping out of the mills and into the steel, into the heart of the factories where men melted iron, moulded power, and often lost their lives doing it. Because if the girls spun the thread of industry, the foundry men shaped its bones, one red-hot bar at a time. While the factory girls spun thread into fabric and stitched the seams of industry together, their fathers, brothers and husbands were down in the fire, melting ore, forging beams, and pulling steel from the earth like modern-day Vulcans. Welcome to the world of the iron and steel workers, the underpaid, overworked, soot-covered men who didn't just build the factories, they built the everything around them, the railways, the tools, the machines that broke their bodies and ran the world. This was not delicate work. This was heat, weight, and danger stacked on top of each other and lit on fire. Literally. Start with the iron foundry. Imagine a warehouse full of open flames, molten metal sloshing around in ladles the size of bathtubs, and men with cloth-wrapped faces and bare hands doing everything by muscle memory and luck. One wrong step and you didn't just get burned, you melted. In the early 1800s, safety equipment consisted of nothing. No steel-toe boots, no protective goggles, no respirators. You worked in your shirt, apron, and a prayer. The heat was so intense it wasn't unusual for workers to collapse from dehydration before noon. And if you died on shift, that wasn't even enough to stop production. Someone else would take your spot before the metal cooled. Some foundries were so loud and hot that it was said you could scream your lungs out and not hear your own voice. And yet men shouted over it anyway, about missing bolts, falling crucibles, the foreman being a bastard again. Communication was less about words and more about instincts. You had to know the job like you knew your heartbeat. The steel mills weren't any better. If anything, they were worse. By the mid-1800s, the Bessemer process made steel cheaper and more widely produced, which meant more steel mills, more jobs, and more dead workers. Men poured molten steel into moulds, balanced red-hot rails with tongs, and hammered rivets with 12-pound sledges. Sparks flew like fireworks. The smell of burnt oil, sweat and iron dust was permanent. It got in your clothes, in your lungs, in your skin. If a crucible cracked, the metal didn't spill, it exploded. One blast could take out 10 men and burn a hole in the ground big enough to bury them, and often that's exactly what happened. But quitting, that wasn't really an option. Most of these men were immigrants, Irish, Polish, Italian, new to the city, new to the country, and desperate for work. If they refused a shift, they were fired. If they asked for more pay, someone else would take their place. There were always more bodies. The line of the desperate never ran out. And because they were poor, they lived near the factories, usually next to them, which meant their kids breathed in soot. Their wives scrubbed the same grime off the windows every day. Their dinner tables were covered in ash before they could even finish a meal. Entire neighbourhoods were built from red brick and lung disease. One of the less-known but constant threats was manganese poisoning. It was used in steel processing, and long exposure led to a form of industrial Parkinson's. Tremors, slurred speech, madness. Some called it shaking palsy. Others just said, "He's gone soft in the head." By 40, many were too broken to work. By 50, dead. The lucky ones lived long enough to bury their friends. And yet, like the girls in the mills, these men had pride. They weren't philosophers or poets, though some were, but they understood what they were doing. They were building the future, with their hands, their backs, their blood. They may not have owned the iron, but they were the ones who made it speak, and they weren't silent forever. By the 1860s and 70s, foundry workers started organising. They whispered about hours, about wages, about walking out. Unions were forming, men were striking, and the bosses, they weren't thrilled. Companies hired Pinkertons, private security with brass knuckles and revolvers, to beat protesters into the ground. Some strikes turned into riots, some into open warfare. In the US, the Homestead Strike of 1892 became infamous when steelworkers clashed with hired guns. Bullets flew, blood spilled, and the message was clear: workers were done dying quietly. Across the Atlantic, similar unrest brewed in places like Sheffield and Glasgow. Men began publishing newsletters, holding underground meetings, refusing overtime. One worker famously refused to clock in and said, "I'm not made of iron, and if I were, you'd find a way to melt me too." But rebellion didn't always come with banners. Sometimes it was subtle. Men sabotaged machines that hurt their friends. They shared scraps of food with new hires who hadn't been paid yet. They slipped money to widows. They told jokes to distract themselves from the fact that the air was killing them. Some wrote poetry, others painted in the evenings using soot as pigment. One steelworker in Pittsburgh sculpted little figurines out of discarded slag. He made a statue of himself, bent over with a hammer in one hand and his back bowed like a bridge. No one remembers his name, but his statue still sits in a museum, unmarked, misattributed. Just another anonymous worker in the archive of progress. Romance in this world. It existed. But it wasn't soft. It was survival. A man might meet his future wife while standing in line for bread, propose with a ring carved from a snapped-off gear, spend his nights off scrubbing coal from his arms before daring to meet her father. They didn't have picnics. They had cold ale on factory steps and the promise that if he didn't die on Monday, he'd still love her by Friday. And sometimes that was enough. So if we remember the Industrial Revolution for its inventions, for steel bridges and railroads and skyscrapers, we should also remember the men who made them possible. Not the architects, the workers, the ones who took metal and fire and made a world out of them, at the cost of their breath, their youth, and more often than not, their lives. They weren't just workers, they were the foundation. And next, we'll head back up from the heat and into the shadowy corners of factory life, where secrets were kept, affairs were whispered, and love sometimes bloomed in the unlikeliest places. Because even in the middle of soot, sweat, and spinning gears, people still found ways to fall in love, and sometimes into scandal. For all the fire, filth and fumes, factory life wasn't entirely mechanical, because people are never just gears in a machine, even when they're treated like it. Beneath the iron clatter and the deafening roar, in the cracks between shifts and the corners of crowded boarding houses, something else bloomed. Affection, desire, romance, sometimes love, often scandal. It might be easy to forget that in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, while men were losing limbs and women were being fined for blinking too slowly, people were still falling for each other, still whispering flirtations while feeding thread into a loom, still stealing glances across boiler rooms, still tucking handwritten notes under lunch pails, and sometimes things got messy. A girl in the textile mill might start talking to a boy from the foundry. Their shifts didn't overlap, but he'd wait outside the boarding house, leaning on a lamppost covered in soot and nerves. She'd sneak out past curfew, shoes wrapped in cloth to silence her steps. They'd walk a block or two, never far, and sit under factory windows still warm from the machines. That was what passed for a date. For most, relationships offered fleeting moments of escape, something tender in a world that was otherwise cold, loud and bruising. There were no candlelit dinners or weekend getaways. There was tea on a crate, maybe some dried fruit if he'd saved up, a flower swiped from a private garden and flattened between pages of a Bible, a scarf hand-stitched between shifts. These gestures carried weight because time and energy were expensive. Choosing to share them with someone meant something. But love didn't always follow the rules, especially when the rules were stacked against the workers to begin with. In the boarding houses where women lived, often 10 to a room, romance was discouraged, not out of morality but out of fear. Pregnancy meant dismissal. Reputation meant survival. The factory needed bodies, not drama. And so, love went underground. Letters were passed in laundry baskets. Messages were scratched into wooden walls with needles. One couple was discovered after an overseer noticed the same thread colour appearing in both their work. They'd been stitching notes into the spools. But love, real or not, didn't protect anyone from consequences. If a woman became pregnant and wasn't married, she was out. No questions, no second chances. Her name was scratched off the payroll and replaced with another girl's by noon. Some tried to hide it, worked until they fainted, gave birth in silence, gave up the child. Others tried to marry in haste, but with no time off and no savings, the ceremony was sometimes just a whispered promise behind the boiler house. Men, on the other hand, could walk away, and many did. But not all stories ended in tragedy. Some couples made it work, somehow. A few got married and continued to live in workers' tenements together, their windows glowing orange from the factory across the street. They raised children between shifts, shared food, traded stories, took turns sleeping. Even love in its worn and wounded form was still something worth building on. Still, for every quiet romance there were just as many affairs, and those came with different risks. Supervisors who took a liking to a worker might offer her easier shifts, better pay, or protection, but it came at a price. It wasn't called coercion back then, it was just the way things worked, and if she resisted, she might find herself transferred, or fired, or worse, whispered about. Some women, seeing no way out, played along to survive. Others found leverage, using the attention to support their families or protect younger girls from worse. And then there were the affairs that crossed class lines. A factory owner's son caught talking too long with a mill girl? That was a scandal. If they were caught together, she was dismissed and labelled immoral. He was given a talking to, maybe sent abroad, maybe not. One girl, 17, was rumoured to have had a secret child by the mill foreman. She disappeared one morning. The child too. No records, no grave, just gossip and silence. Whispers like that clung to factory walls. Everyone heard them. No one repeated them, not loudly anyway. But the stories didn't stop. People still reached for one another, still risked connection, even if the world punished them for it. One woman wrote in her diary that her greatest rebellion wasn't striking or refusing overtime. It was choosing whom to kiss. She kissed a man with coal under his nails and scars across his palms, and in that moment she said, "I felt human, like the machine couldn't own me." For the workers, romance wasn't a luxury. It was a form of resistance. The act of caring, of loving, in a system designed to grind you down was itself a rebellion. It said, "I still feel. I still choose. I'm not just surviving. I'm living." These weren't fairy tales. They weren't happily ever afters. Most relationships ended in more work, more mouths to feed, more struggle. But that didn't stop anyone from trying. Because even in the darkest, dustiest corners of the factory floor, people reached for each other. They held hands in the boiler room, kissed in the storeroom, wrote each other poems on the back of paycheck stubs. They dared to hope that even in a world of smoke and metal there could be a spark. Next, we leave the scandal behind and head into the brain of the machine. The clerks, the overseers, the pencil pushers in their waistcoats and pocket watches. They weren't the ones sweating on the floor, but they kept the wheels spinning, and sometimes they had blood on their hands too. For every 100 workers sweating on the floor, there was one man with a clean shirt, a pocket watch, and just enough power to ruin someone's life. They weren't owners, not really. They weren't workers either. They didn't dig, haul, or lose fingers to the loom. But they were there, walking the floorboards in polished boots, watching, taking notes, and deciding who got to keep their job and who got tossed out like scrap. The factory overseers, the clerks, the middlemen, these were the eyes of the system, the ones who enforced quotas, calculated pay, tracked absences, and enforced discipline. They were the first stop on the ladder of authority, close enough to touch the working class, just far enough to stay dry when the blood started flowing. Some started out on the floor. They'd worked the machines once, knew the burns, had the scars, but now they wore waistcoats, held clipboards, and spoke softly, the kind of soft that still made you clench your teeth. Others had never done a day of manual labour in their lives. They came in young, educated, or well-connected. Maybe they were a nephew of someone higher up. Maybe they'd been good with numbers. Maybe they just knew how to nod at the right moment. But whatever their origin, once they had the job, their loyalty wasn't to the workers. It was to production, to numbers, to efficiency. The shift bell rang. They were at the gate. A man was 5 minutes late. Noted. A woman looked tired. Warned. A child slowed down near a spinning mule. Yelled at, then docked pay. Overseers were the ones who handed out fines. Not the big ones. Not the kind that ruin a business. The petty, bleeding kind. A penny here for talking. 2p for spilling oil. Half a day's wage for not tying your apron properly. They didn't kill workers. Not directly. But they helped starve them slowly. One clerk in a Lancashire cotton mill once deducted 3 hours' pay from a 12-year-old girl for slouching. When her mother complained, the clerk accused her of impertinence and sent both packing. The girl ended up on the street. No appeal, no recourse. It was all in the ledger. The clerks and overseers weren't monsters, at least not always. Some were just as trapped as the people they managed. The difference was they were trapped in respectability, in expectations, in loyalty to the very system chewing them alive from the other end. Because above them were the owners, and the owners didn't want excuses, they wanted numbers, quotas, profit margins. Every minute of downtime meant money lost. Every broken gear meant a potential delay. The overseer's job wasn't to care, it was to deliver. So if that meant keeping a child at the machine despite a bloody bandage, so be it. If it meant working a woman through a miscarriage because she looked fine, so be it. If it meant firing a man who lost his thumb and couldn't hit his old speed, so be it. To them, efficiency wasn't a number, it was God. But the power didn't stop at punishments. Overseers controlled opportunities too. Better shifts, easier machines, fewer hours on the night watch. These perks weren't handed out fairly. They were traded. For loyalty, for obedience, sometimes for silence, and sometimes for worse. A young woman hoping for a break from the dye vats might be told to be friendly with the floor manager. A teenage boy might be threatened with dismissal unless he snitched on a co-worker talking about unions. They knew how to pressure without touching, how to wound without striking, how to keep their hands clean while the work got dirtier. But not all of them played the part so neatly. Some oversaw too long, started to see the workers not as bodies but as people, watched them fall in love, collapse from exhaustion, mourn a friend who died in the mill and couldn't keep looking away. There were a few who passed warnings in secret. Leave early, they're checking today. Don't speak up in the meeting. Say you were sick, I'll cover you. One clerk, a middle-aged man with a limp from an old injury, kept an informal fund, sneaking coins from his own pocket to workers whose kids were sick or whose husbands had died. He was caught eventually, fired without severance, last seen boarding a train east with no luggage and no destination. Then there were those who cracked, couldn't take the guilt, couldn't reconcile the numbers with the faces. One overseer in Sheffield locked himself in his office and drank until the end of the quarter. Another walked off mid-shift and never came back. Their replacements arrived by the following Monday, because to the factory there was always someone else, a new boot to step in, a new hand to hold the pen. The system didn't pause to grieve or reflect. It just absorbed the next man and kept churning. But even in the shadows, some clerks kept records, hidden ledgers, personal journals. One found years later recorded not the day's output, but the number of injuries on a particular line, the names, the severity. Sometimes a note, Jane, 12, burned hand, returned next day. That ledger is now in a museum. They didn't build the machines, they didn't feed the fires, but they were the ones who kept the tally, who reduced a lifetime of labour to a line item and a weekly wage slip. And yet they weren't untouchable. When strikes began to gain strength, when unions began to organise underground, when workers grew tired of whispers and fines and abuse, the overseers were the first to face the anger. One was chased out of a boarding house by a group of laid-off men wielding broken chairs. Another had his office ransacked during a walkout. The workers didn't steal money, they stole the clock, just to say, "You don't own our time anymore." And in that moment, the overseers weren't bosses. They were just men, caught in a machine that didn't care whether they walked or crawled, as long as the gears turned. Next, we follow that thread of rebellion deeper, into the dark, clattering corridors of the labour movement itself, where whispers turned into chants, and workers who had nothing left finally stood up and said, "Enough." Because when the machine doesn't stop, sometimes the only option left is to break it. The factory whistle blew, the machines roared, and somewhere deep in the belly of the industrial beast a quiet revolution was stirring. Because as brutal as the work was, as punishing as the overseers could be, there was something else growing in those sweat-soaked floors and soot-streaked neighbourhoods. A shared anger, a shared hope, and eventually a shared voice. It started small. A whispered complaint over meagre wages, a secret meeting in a cramped boarding house, a past note with the words strike or union written carefully in shaky handwriting. Workers were beginning to realise something dangerous. They weren't alone. They were many. They were a workforce, and together they might just have power. The early labour movement wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a parade with banners and speeches. It was fear and risk. Because organising a strike in the 1800s meant losing your job, your rent, your friends, and sometimes your freedom. Many governments sided with the factory owners. Police cracked down on meetings. Courts issued injunctions to break strikes. And in some places, union leaders were jailed or worse. But that didn't stop the workers. In Britain, the Chartists of the 1830s and 40s fought for political reform, demanding voting rights for working men. Their protests were met with violence, but their spirit laid the groundwork for labour rights. In the textile mills of New England, young mill girls organised turnouts, walking off the job in protest against wage cuts and brutal hours. Their strikes weren't always successful, but they were early sparks that caught fire. One famous event was the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado, 1914, where striking coal miners and their families were attacked by the National Guard. Mothers and children were killed. Men were shot down. The bloodshed shocked the nation and forced a reckoning. But long before the headlines, it was the quiet, persistent pressure of thousands of small actions that changed the game. Workers shared secret hand signals to warn of supervisors. They passed coded letters to coordinate walkouts. They spread stories of successful strikes in other towns to inspire courage. Sometimes sabotage was the weapon of choice. A snapped belt here, a spilled bucket of oil there, a machine mysteriously breaking down right before quota time. And the bosses, they fought back hard. Employers hired strikebreakers, workers desperate enough to cross picket lines for a paycheck. They hired Pinkertons and private security to intimidate, beat and arrest protesters. They blacklisted organisers so they couldn't find work anywhere. But for every setback, the labour movement grew stronger. By the late 1800s, unions were formalising. Groups like the Knights of Labour, and later the American Federation of Labour, AFL, started gaining membership by the thousands. These organisations fought for basic rights: the 8-hour workday, safer conditions, child labour laws and fair wages. And though progress was slow, agonisingly slow, it was real. Strikes became more coordinated. Walkouts spread across industries and cities. Workers who had once been isolated found strength in numbers. They sang songs of resistance, wrote poems about broken backs and broken promises, held rallies where men and women stood side by side demanding dignity. The labour movement was never perfect. It struggled with issues of race, gender, and inclusion. Sometimes it fought its own members as fiercely as the bosses. But it was the first real crack in the system that treated workers like disposable cogs. And here's the wild part. It wasn't just the factory floor that changed. The strikes, protests and union meetings sparked debates in parliaments and Congress. They inspired new laws, the kinds that actually protected workers. Laws limiting child labour, laws requiring safety inspections, laws mandating minimum wages. Some factory owners learned to grudgingly accept unions, others fought tooth and nail to crush them. But one thing was clear. The Industrial Revolution was not just a story of machines and money. It was a story of people, battered, bruised, but unbroken. People who decided they weren't just going to be ground down, who said, "We want more." So next time you cross a bridge, ride a train or work a shift, remember those early labourers who fought in sweat and blood so you might have a better life. Because the fight didn't end then, it just changed. Coming up next, we'll look closer at the women who led and shaped this movement. Not just the factory girls who worked the looms, but the fierce activists who marched, spoke and organised against all odds. Their stories are brutal, inspiring and too often forgotten. While the grinding machines roared and men hammered steel, it was often the women, factory girls, mothers and fierce activists who sparked some of the most powerful battles of the labour movement. They were the voices that cut through the noise, the hands that stitched together solidarity, and the fire that refused to be snuffed out. Women in the Industrial Revolution weren't just passive victims of the system, they were fighters. From the moment they stepped into the factories, many understood that their labour wasn't just about keeping the family afloat, it was about justice. Take the Lowell Mill girls, for example. They weren't just quiet workers humming hymns while the machines spun around them. No, these young women took to the streets and the newspapers, wielding their words like weapons. When wages were slashed or hours extended, they organised strikes that shocked the establishment. In 1836, over 1,500 mill girls walked out, defying the expectation that women should just silently endure. But it wasn't just about the mills. Women across Britain, the United States, and beyond began forming unions, clubs and associations dedicated to workers' rights and social reform. They met in cramped basements and church halls, trading stories, strategies, and sometimes baked goods to raise funds for their cause. These women understood something that their male counterparts sometimes didn't. Labour rights and women's rights were intertwined. The fight for better wages was also a fight for respect. The fight for safer conditions was also a fight against exploitation. The fight for an 8-hour day was also a fight for dignity. Many women became charismatic leaders. Sarah Bagley, a Lowell Mill girl turned labour organiser, wrote letters, led petitions, and founded the Female Labour Reform Association, demanding shorter hours and better pay. She faced scorn and threats, but she didn't back down. Then there was Mother Jones, whose real name was Mary Harris Jones. Though she started later, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, her fiery speeches, relentless organising, and willingness to march alongside miners and textile workers made her a legend. She said famously, "I'm not a humanitarian, I'm a hellraiser." Women's activism wasn't without sacrifice. They risked being blacklisted, arrested, even beaten by police or hired thugs. Some were branded troublemakers, hysterical or unfeminine, and those labels could destroy reputations and livelihoods. But the women endured. They used every tool available: public lectures, petitions, strikes, and yes, sometimes sabotage. They organised boycotts of factories and stores. They wrote articles exposing abuses. They lobbied politicians, often men who had no interest in hearing them. Their voices helped push through early labour laws, child labour restrictions, factory inspections, limits on working hours. Many of these reforms came because of persistent women who refused to be ignored. At home, they juggled factory shifts with childcare and household duties, a double burden most men didn't understand. But in their hearts, they carried the hope that the next generation might not have to suffer the same fate. And romance. It didn't stop just because a woman was a fighter. Many activists found partners among fellow workers and organisers, sometimes in secret, sometimes out loud. Love was complicated in the midst of picket lines and protests, but it was real. These women were the backbone of the labour movement, not just cogs in a machine, but sparks that ignited change. Their stories often get buried beneath statistics and legislation, but they're there, in letters, newspapers, and whispered memories. Next, we'll shift focus from the factory floor to the family table, exploring what life was really like at home for these workers, where exhaustion met love, hope met hardship, and the fight for survival continued beyond the gates. Because the Industrial Revolution didn't just change work, it changed life itself. When the factory whistle blew its final shrill note at the end of the day, the machine slowed and the workers spilled out onto the streets. They weren't done, not by a long shot. Because the fight didn't stop at the factory gates. It followed them home, into cramped tenements, cold rooms and kitchens lit by flickering candles. Life for the industrial worker wasn't just about labouring from dawn till dusk. It was about surviving the hours after, the moments between shifts when bodies ached, tempers frayed, and families struggled to hold together. Most workers lived in neighbourhoods built from red brick and soot, rows of narrow, overcrowded houses pressed side by side like dominoes. Inside, entire families shared single rooms. Parents and children huddled together on threadbare mattresses, trying to steal a few hours of sleep before the next day's grind. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. The air was thick with smoke, dampness, and the smell of coal dust that clung stubbornly to skin and clothes. Water came from a shared pump down the street, and bathrooms were often outhouses shared by dozens. Disease thrived in these conditions. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhoid were constant threats. Children didn't escape this reality. In fact, for many, childhood was stolen by work. While some kids laboured in factories, others stayed home to care for siblings or work odd jobs to help the family make ends meet. Food was meagre and repetitive. Thick stews made from cheap cuts of meat, hard bread soaked in whatever broth was available. Vegetables were a rarity. Fresh fruit was a luxury saved for special occasions. But despite the hardship, families found ways to endure. Parents told stories to distract from the cold. Neighbours shared whatever scraps they could spare. Children played games in alleys, finding joy in the smallest things. A piece of chalk, a cracked marble, a sunbeam between the buildings. Marriage and courtship were complicated by poverty and cramped living conditions. Young couples often couldn't afford a proper home or wedding, so they improvised, gathering friends for informal ceremonies, pooling what little money they had for a new set of clothes. Pregnancy and childbirth were perilous. Medical care was limited and complications were common. Women often gave birth at home, aided by neighbours or midwives. Infant mortality rates were high, casting a constant shadow over growing families. Yet, amidst these hardships, love and loyalty flourished. Families supported one another in ways the factories never could. Parents worked multiple jobs to keep children in school. Siblings shared clothes and dreams. Husbands and wives leaned on each other through exhaustion and despair. Religion often provided comfort and community. Churches were places not just of worship but of support, offering charity, education, and a rare chance for respite. At the same time, many families lived in fear of illness, eviction, or the next round of layoffs. Financial instability was a constant spectre, and yet, for all the struggle, these homes were the foundation of resilience, the place where workers could momentarily shed the grime of labour and dream of a better future. Because the Industrial Revolution wasn't just about machines and factories, it was about the people who lived and loved through it all. Up next, we'll peel back the curtain on the darkest side of this era, the rampant child labour that powered the factories and broke countless young lives. It's a grim story, but one that can't be ignored if we want to understand what life was really like for industrial workers and their families. In the shadow of the great smokestacks and beneath the thunderous clatter of the machines, you'd find them, the smallest bodies working the hardest jobs. Children, too young to vote, too young to fight, but old enough to be trapped in the gears of industry. Child labour wasn't a footnote in the Industrial Revolution. It was one of its darkest pillars, a grim necessity for many families and factory owners alike. If you think factory work was brutal for adults, imagine it for a 7-year-old with tiny hands and lungs filling with dust. Factories, mines and mills craved cheap, nimble labour. Children could squeeze into tight spaces to fix broken threads or crawl under machines to retrieve dropped tools. They ran errands faster than adults, climbed ladders with ease, and, most importantly for employers, they were paid a fraction of adult wages. Some children worked 12, 14, even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their work days began before sunrise and often stretched into the dark with no breaks beyond the barest lunch scraps. In textile mills, children operated the scavenger, a terrifying machine that required them to crawl beneath giant spinning looms to collect loose cotton. One wrong move meant losing a finger, a hand, or worse. In coal mines, kids called trappers sat in darkness for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors to control airflow. Some pulled heavy carts through narrow tunnels, their bodies bent unnaturally by the cramped conditions. It was back-breaking, breath-stealing work. Doctors of the time noted alarming rates of deformities among working children, crooked spines, stunted growth, and lung diseases from inhaling dust and fumes. Injuries were common, and safety regulations were nearly non-existent. At home, these children were often so exhausted they barely had the strength to eat or sleep. Their education, non-existent. Most never saw a classroom, their future shackled to the factory floor. Yet for many families, sending children to work was a matter of survival. Wages from a child could make the difference between rent paid or eviction on the doorstep. Reformers and activists fought fiercely against child labour. One of the earliest victories was the Factory Acts in Britain, passed in the early 19th century, which limited working hours and set minimum ages for employment, but enforcement was patchy at best. In the US, the fight dragged on well into the 20th century, with powerful industrial interests resisting change. Stories of children as young as 5 working in factories shocked the public, once exposed by journalists known as muckrakers. One heartbreaking account described a 10-year-old boy who lost an arm in a factory accident, but was forced to return to work because his family had no other income. Another told of a girl who died from inhaling toxic chemicals, her death barely noticed beyond the factory walls. Despite the danger, many children showed remarkable resilience, sometimes courage that bordered on desperation. Some tried to unionize or strike, often at great risk. Others found small joys amid the misery: a stolen apple, a whispered story, a secret friendship. Their plight finally helped fuel broader labour reforms, laws that gradually raised working ages, shortened hours, and improved conditions. But for too many, the damage was permanent. The legacy of child labour is a reminder that progress came at a price, one paid in broken bodies and stolen childhoods. As we close this chapter, remember, the Industrial Revolution was not just an era of invention and growth. It was a time when millions of lives were reshaped, often harshly, by the relentless demands of industry. And finally, if you've made it this far, don't forget to like and subscribe if you genuinely enjoyed this journey into history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's amazing to connect with all of you around the world. Now sit back, relax, and listen to the calming sounds of the old factory whistle, fading into the night as you drift into a peaceful sleep. Because after all this, you've earned it.